This is a meeting of the Devens Jurisdiction Framework Committee. Today is January 8th, 2025. My name is Victor Normand. I will be chairing this meeting. Roll call. Janice Livingston.
Here.
Robert Pontbriand.
Here.
Rich Maori. Dan Nason.
Here.
Ryan Sawyer.
Here.
Logan Breeze.
Here.
Brian Hildebrand. I can't see who is zoomed in here.
No.
Bill Marshall.
Oh, there he is. You can see it. There's Bill.
Okay.
Neil Angus.
Here.
John Cater. Jim Geller is here. So Jim, you'll be voting if that's required in John's absence. Odile Smith. Ryan McDivitt.
Here.
Okay, Ryan, same thing. You'll be voting if votes are called. Kristen Cullen. We have a majority. We are in order. We have an introduction. Dan?
Yes, well, this today also is Allison Mitchell, the Assistant Town Administrator in Harvard. So I welcome her to the group.
Hello.
Okay. Now, is Allison to be an alternate for
Me?
Rich Maori? Or you?
Yes.
Okay. So you'll have Allison's contact information. Okay, very good. We have minutes from our meeting of December 11th.
Hold on. I'll get them up.
Any comments?
Mr. Chair, I just would like to thank Selectman Livingston for taking the minutes in my absence for December from air.
It's my first time, people. It was
Good job, and thank
not
you.
fun.
Any comments, changes, corrections? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
By Robert, is there a second?
Second.
Neil, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Without objection, the minutes are approved unanimously. Now, today's minute taker will be the town of Harvard, and we're all set. Very good. Stakeholder update, town of Air.
Mr. Chair, so the Town of Air's local Devens Resolution Committee has their next meeting next Wednesday, January 15th. Neil Angus from the Devens Enterprise Commission is going to be at that meeting to meet with the committee with sort of an overview of what the deck does and the issues of Devens. So we're looking forward to that. And then I think, as the committee's aware, per the governor's working group, the select board selected Selectman Sean Copeland to be AIR's representative to the governor's working group. I know they were looking for a select board member from each of the towns. So that's the update from AIR right now.
Okay. Is AIR going to have a third member representing?
Yes, so we hope to very shortly.
Okay,
Yep.
very good. Town of Harvard, the Harvard Devens Jurisdiction Committee did meet in December. They received an update on the work of this committee. Also, were notified that Susan Mary Redinger, select board member in Harvard, has been appointed to the Economic Development Bill Housing Working Group, or whatever they will eventually be called. And the committee worked on the Devens and land use submission for the framework matrix. And that's it. Town of Shirley.
There's no significant updates. We are continuing to try and populate not only what would be the Shirley Devens Framework Committee, but also we have a vacant member or vacant seat for Devens Enterprise Commission that we've been advertising for as well. So we have not gotten any significant responses, but we do continue to advertise for it. So
Okay.
thank you.
Very good. Devens representative Jim.
Just would note that the Devens Committee meets tonight, and would expect a resolution on who's going to be part of the housing group at that time.
Okay. Devens Enterprise Commission. Bill or Neil?
I'll start if Bill has anything else to add. We worked on the land use matrix at our last meeting, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on the agenda. And at our last meeting, the commission did appoint myself as a representative to the housing working group that the state is establishing, with Mr. Marshall as the alternate, if there are alternates available. We don't know much about what's going to happen, but we'll see what happens on the 19th, I think it is.
20th, 20.
21st.
Okay, very good. Old business. Working group update. So now there are 3 members of this committee that are on the housing working group. Neil, Brian, Hildebrand, and who am I missing? Well, I guess 2 is good. I'm just okay. Anyway, so I think that the good news is that
Back on what's happening.
that's right. The good news that we will have some direct feedback on whatever the working group is up to. And I believe the first meeting is the 21st.
It is the 21st at 1:30.
Yep. Where's the meeting to be held?
Mass Development Offices, I'm assuming, in Vicksburg Conference Room.
Is it a public meeting?
I believe so, but I haven't heard yet. So no agenda has been posted yet. So I would assume it's going to be a public meeting. Since
What time will the meeting be?
1:30.
Okay, I skipped over the Devens Jurisdiction Framework Committee. This committee's working group on crafting a RFP for using the state funds. We did not meet since our last meeting. What we're in the process of doing is collecting RFPs that the towns or the Enterprise Commission have used in the past to procure professional services, to see if there is a template there that the working group can use or modify. And we will need to meet next month. Robert,
Okay.
will
We'll
you
set something up. Yep.
take responsibility for that? And then we'll continue to work on crafting an RFP. Any update on when funds might be available?
I will follow up. They haven't been released yet, but we were told January, and it's January, so I'll follow up.
Good. Okay, moving right along. The invitation to mass development. I think you've all received a copy of the letter that I received from the new CEO at Mass Development. That is the most recent communication that I have had. It's been 3 weeks, so I think that's not an unreasonable amount of time to.
Not during the holiday season, so, yeah.
So hopefully before our next meeting, we'll have some feedback as to whether Mass Development will be participating in this committee, or whether the new CEO will come to one of our meetings and introduce herself. Okay. Okay, zoning and land use framework matrix. We'll start with air.
So, Mr. Chair, is very similar, I think, to some of the other stakeholders. In the event of potential disposition, AIR would undertake sort of a comprehensive review of the zoning and land use policies of Devens to develop the appropriate zoning or land use plan. I know other stakeholders have talked about, as we do as well, the implementation potentially of an overlay district may be one option to incorporate Devens zoning and land use changes. As also mentioned, in the situation where land parcels extend into other towns, look at obviously the appropriate, whether it's an intermunicipal agreement or other legal instrument. Specifically, as we've talked, since a sizable portion of Vicksburg Square is within the boundaries of Air, the historic boundaries, the town, we would envision, would undertake really a comprehensive review and study specifically of Vicksburg Square to fully study the implications of changing zoning there. And that's really significant. The Vicksburg Square piece, regardless of disposition, is significant to not only Air in Devens, but the whole region. So that would be a priority in the scope from Air. So that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Okay, very good. So for the town of Harvard, it's envisioned that Devens would become an overlay district, that no changes be made to the existing zoning. And similar to what it doesn't, we do not mention Vicksburg Square in our position, but the thought of an intermunicipal agreement to manage zoning and other matter, land use with respect to Vicksburg Square would be how we would envision that. The Harvard statement just recognizes that the durability of zoning maps, bylaws, and regulations are very important, particularly to the businesses at Devens, especially, and the residents as well, knowing that the zoning that exists now will be the zoning going forward. So we acknowledge that. And also just acknowledge that Harvard zoning is primarily residential and agricultural, whereas Devens is primarily commercial. So there really isn't a fit between the two sets of zoning bylaws. And then dealing with any future zone changes, our statement references Section 5 of the Mass General Laws, Chapter 40A, and I believe that will require a town meeting and a vote of the town to make any changes to zoning that may be proposed. Is that accurate?
Yes.
For that section? Okay. Okay, Town of Shirley.
Very similar to the town of Harvard and Air. Shirley's current zoning and land use bylaws are really geared towards kind of a residential rural community, which is not exactly compatible with how Devens is currently zoned. So we would most likely do an overlay district, just as the other two towns had suggested, to keep the zoning relatively consistent, if not the same as what they currently are in Devens. And same thing depending on, if there were extended boundaries, perhaps an intermunicipal agreement would be required or necessary. So mirrors very much the town of Harvard and Air.
Okay, very good. Devens. Jim?
So I would make 3 points. One is that we would not anticipate any significant changes at the time of the transition, since most of the Devens will have been redeveloped at that point. So we don't see any initial changes. We see the continuation of the use of the Devens Enterprise Commission for a transition period, probably a lengthy one. Then the third point that we would make is simply that any future changes in zoning would not be subject to super town meeting.
It would be a super town meeting of one town. So
Still a super town.
still, yeah. Okay, good. Neil, the deck, status quo.
So currently, zoning and land use are governed by the reuse plan, the Devens bylaws, and the rules and regulations. Those would continue to be maintained. We'd follow the patterns of development that are prescribed in the reuse plan. So continue with the way zoning is currently done. For projects that come in, we do a determination of zoning compliance to make sure that the proposed use is compatible with the patterns reflected in the land use plan, in the reuse plan, sorry. And any substantial changes to zoning would continue to go through Chapter 498, which is the supertown meeting process. So continue on with the combined, unified, and expedited permitting system as well. So.
Very good. Okay, our next topic for the framework matrix is environmental issues. And at our last meeting, I think it was John Catter who requested a clarification on that. So I thought we'd have a discussion here. Just under the context that environmental issues would be from the perspective of a municipality and not necessarily a Superfund site. So, Neil, you provide us some guidance on exactly what, how we would, what the distinction would be going forward.
It was my impression that the environmental issues were separated out because it's a Superfund site. Environmental issues are already addressed in our zoning. The commission acts as the local conservation commission. We're subject to the Wetlands Protection Act. So the major environmental issues at Devens are, the cleanup, the continued cleanup. So the partnership with the Army, the EPA, the DEP, and Mass Development, I think, that's going to continue no matter what happens, I think. So we've got to factor how that's going to play into the future of Devens if Air takes over, if Harvard takes over, if it becomes its own town or what. So I think it's making sure that we continue to factor that into the decision-making process, that there is ongoing cleanup and ongoing partnerships between those four agencies.
Okay. What is the extent of environmental cleanup that remains to be undertaken? Do you know?
I don't know it all, but I know there are some, Salerno Circle, they're still working on the removal of some of the slabs from the former housing that was up there, and there's some contaminated soils underneath. The airfield still has a contamination plume. Subsequently, those are the two special use districts in Devens, and part of the reason they're zoned special use is because I think of the legacy contamination issues. There are other smaller remedial items that are being done with the Army, but a lot of cleanup has been done to date, but those are the two main areas that I'm aware of.
Okay. What's the distinction between what the Army is responsible for and what Mass Development would be responsible for?
I'm not aware of the details on that. That's going to be up to the programmatic agreement and the agreement between the land disposition agreement between the Army and the transfer to Mass Development.
Right. The simplified explanation that I've always lived with is that the Army is responsible for anything below the ground and Mass Development above the ground. So in other words, any oil spills or any contaminants in the soil, the Army is forever on the hook for that as a Superfund site. But any contamination like asbestos, lead paint, or whatever in a building that Mass Development owns, Mass Development is responsible for cleaning that up. Mass Development using Devens funds, Devens project funds to do that. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but that.
Another environmental item that is on everybody's mind is PFAS, an emerging contaminant. So it's something that will continue to be of concern going forward. I mean, Devens has done a lot to clean up the water supply with all the new filtration systems to be down to non-detectable levels, but it still persists in the soils, in the water, the groundwater. And the Army is actively involved in the investigations for that, along with the surrounding towns.
And what would get the Army out from under that would be any contamination caused by a newer business at Devens, if that could be determined. Does that sound accurate?
Possibly, I don't know.
So, yeah. Okay, now, so this is an interesting question with respect to permanent government going forward. Is the Army is responsible for cleaning up areas. The agreement says they clean it up to standards consistent with zoning, so that an area that is zoned for commercial use would have to be cleaned up to a commercial standard. and an area that's zoned residential would have to be cleaned up to a residential standard, which is a higher standard, as I understand it. Does that sound accurate?
Yep.
You know, anyone else who is familiar with this, please jump in. So the question is, if particularly I think has relevance with the working group and expanding housing at Devens, if the working group proposes to expand housing in an area that is not zoned residential, but may have been contaminated, there could be a gap between the cleanup that the Army has done to a commercial standard and the cleanup that's required in order to develop for residential use. And I'm thinking in particular Salerno Circle, which was zone commercial, and the Army is actively cleaning that, and I understand nearly completed. If the working group determines that that would be an appropriate site for housing, who would be responsible for cleaning it to that standard? And I think that has relevance with respect to determining permanent government, because a decision on permanent government may be made well ahead of a decision to develop a commercial area. So I think that perhaps what we all ought to include in next week's submission is at least some acknowledgement that if the state is going to propose a housing use on land that's not zoned residential, then the state ought to be obligated to clean it to a residential standard, and not that burden should not fall on the town. Does that make any sense? That is the way in which I see environmental issues becoming complicated going forward.
Would it be the state or the Army? I mean, depending on.
Well,
or that's for.
I think it has come up that the Army is prepared to clean up any contamination in the soil, but to whatever the agreement, the programmatic agreement that Neil referred to, recognizes that they have to clean up to whatever standard the three towns approved with respect to the zoning, with respect to the reuse plan and subsequent zoning, so that it could get complicated. Now, I think what would happen is that the cleanup burden there would be an attempt to pass that along to a developer. If you want to develop this land for a housing use, you have to clean it up, which could chill any effort to develop housing, principally because environmental cleanup is unknown. The extent of environmental cleanup typically is unknown until well into the actual cleanup.
Well, your example of Salerno Circle, there's been significant studies done, and they're aware of what levels of cleanup need to be done to get it to, whatever standard is required per that zoning. But your question about, if we look at Salerno Circle, who knows? I mean, this will all be determined at the first working group meeting, I'm assuming, but it's my understanding that Salerno Circle is not even on the table for housing. They're looking at the Innovation Technology Center business district only for additional housing for up to 400 units. That's what the legislation talks about. It does say including but not limited to, but I think that is the intent of the legislation, and we'll get clarification on that at the first working group meeting. But to your point, the same issue is there, because Vicksburg Square is currently not zoned for residential, and if it's cleaned up to commercial standards versus, I don't think it's residential standards, I think it's unrestricted standards is the cleanup term for the difference between, a commercial site versus a residential site. Residential requires it to be cleaned up to unrestricted standards. And so that issue will still exist, if we want to put housing in the Innovation Technology Center district. So it's a valid question.
Okay. And it's safe to assume that if that doesn't get brought up, you will bring it up, so that.
I just wrote it down, so I will, I will definitely.
Well, and
bring
also
that up.
just to clear up some, I think this might not be a bad time, also to, because Neil is here and is going to be at that meeting, anything that we think should be brought up, it might not be a bad time to bring that to Neil's attention. And as you mentioned, Neil, it says 400 units, but it doesn't say specifically Vicksburg Square. So if they put several hundred units not in Vicksburg Square, what then is the future of Vicksburg Square?
It's 400 units in the up to 400 units in the ITC district, which is the majority of it is Vicksburg Square, but it does circle around other portions of Rogers Field as well. So, but it's not opening up all of Devens to housing everywhere. That's my understanding. Again, I am assuming all this will be clarified at the first meeting. So I think it'll be good to hear what happens at the first meeting, and then we can report back. And if there's any questions or issues, additional issues that people want to bring forward, we can do that.
Okay, good. Speaking of housing, are you aware of any activity that Mass Development has taken with respect to housing in the zone that is zoned residential?
I'm not aware of any. I mean, they are looking into, doing a little more in-depth planning on the remaining lands that are currently zoned residential for what type of residential could happen there, but nothing has been started that I'm aware of.
And I assume that early on in their planning process, they would come before the DEC in a preliminary fashion and get some feedback.
I would think at some point, we've had preliminary discussions with when the cap was there. There was 12 units remaining under the cap, and they have, met with a developer about finishing off those 12 units. I don't know if things will change now because of that, but because the cap's been lifted. But it's my understanding that they're doing a little more in-depth analysis on the remaining lands to see what could go there before they start looking for developers or moving forward on anything. But yes, they would need to come before the DEC for any type of approvals, and prior to any approvals, they do need to do pre-application meetings with us. So we usually get involved early on in the process to make sure that whoever they're moving forward with, it's consistent with the zoning, with the reuse plan, and the existing regulations.
Do you know if any progress has been made with respect to the multifamily building at Devens Commons?
The revised building permit has been submitted, so we're waiting for the application fee, which is expected to be submitted tomorrow. So that's positive forward movement.
Can we assume they got financing for the project?
I never like to assume, but that is a good. It's not a small permit fee, so we assume that if they're putting forth the permit fee, that this is seriously going forward. So,
what is the permit fee for that project?
Cautiously optimistic. They've already paid a significant amount, but the current the remainder balance that they were required is a little over $60,000.
50,000.
60.
60,000.
Again, that's part of our unified permitting process, which goes from site plan approval through to building. So it includes the building permit fees and subsequent fees. So it sounds like a big number, but when you look at it across the entirety of the project, it's a reasonable number.
So says the DEC.
So says I.
Any other comments, questions for Neil? Okay. Public comment.
Where do you want?
Have a seat if you like.
Sure.
Identify yourself.
Paul Green, Town of Harvard, member of the HDJC. I just want to comment that as we look at the Innovation and Technology District, And as you just indicated, Neil, that some of us would like to see mass development adhere to the statements in Chapter 498 that direct it not only to provide for housing, but to provide for educational uses as well. And we don't know what the future will bring. We don't know how many units of housing may be there in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. But I do know that we have some unsold land now that could be designated as municipal use or even municipal educational use, and simply set aside whether that will ever be used, for athletic fields or elementary or, a kid's playground or park. I don't know, but I think this is an opportunity today to do what's right for the future, and we should bear that in mind. Otherwise, I fear that the normal impulses of everyone will be to simply build every commercial acre out, build every housing acre out, and there's more to a dense urban area than industry and housing. I mean, who knows, you may need a bigger area for a fire station as more stuff comes in, right? So I want to keep that on the table. And I hope that the Air Shirley School District and the Harvard school system, concur in that.
Okay, so noted.
Thanks.
Any other comments? Yes, identify yourself, come to the table.
Yeah, my name is Patrick Hughes. I'm a resident of Air. My comments will take a bit because you'll see why once I get into them. I've been resident of Air for 28 years. I just retired from a 47-year career in what's known as the luxury home industry. If you're familiar with the company Thought Forms, big architecturally driven homes for people who are quite wealthy. Because I'm an environmentalist, I've always been interested in more responsible building, know a great deal about land use and subdivision development. Did a lot of volunteering, was on the board of the National River Watershed Association, other things, but related to Devens specifically, I was on the Devens Open Space and Recreation Committee for 6 years, working with Heidi and all the great work she did, and at the invitation of Paul Bresnan, knowing that background, was part of the land use and zoning of the disposition process from 18 years ago.
I can see the guest on the screen there trying to hear you. So.
Oh, okay. Anyways, and was also part of a group known as Sustainable Design Working Group, who did a presentation to Mass Development, became the RFP that became the Transformation subdivision. I actually worked for Transformations. Unfortunately, in its last year, was not able to help prevent it from going down, which is sad because it was really innovative. I was also negotiating with the Emerson Green developer 6 years ago to come on board and be the project manager to run that when I landed the job I had for the last 5.5 years, which was a full-time estimator, which after 25 years of running construction site, I welcomed an office job. What piqued my interest was last year that editorial in the Boston Globe about why aren't we building housing at Devens. Interestingly, I had a column in the local paper back when we had a paper for many years, and wrote almost exactly the same editorial over 20 years ago as I was watching Air's forested land get swallowed up by developers. So my interest in showing up here is a rather extensive background in building, housing, knowledge of Devens. To further note that, one of my closest friends is Glenn Garber, the original director of the Devens Enterprise Commission, and another very good friend is Peter Lowett, who I'm sure you all know. Kudos to him for his excellent work bringing Devens to where it is. And so that working group on housing is something, obviously, I bring an extensive background to and be very interested in. And Robert, I sent interest in that several weeks ago. It was before the holidays. I realized things get a little lost.
All right, let me check Patrick.
Yeah, that I would be interested in that, and had a conversation with Neil a number of weeks ago, who remembers me from that whole process, of why I would be valuable to that. So anyways, being retired, I have now time to look in. I'm curious to see what's going on, having been, part of this process like that. So that's my 2 cents. I hope that was the condensed version of it. So.
Okay, thanks for your comments. Anyone else?
Richard Enright, 19 Chance Street, Devens resident for 8 years, I guess. Live in the Emerson Green section. I'm wondering, there's been a lot of talk about housing, which I appreciate because there's not enough in the area, obviously, and it affects the economic development of Massachusetts in general, and this area, maybe more specifically. I hope that people, when they discuss housing, would consider the fact that home ownership in the United States is going down because people are priced out of the market. Homes that get built maybe that are really expensive, so people that are just starting out,
Exactly.
right, can't afford anything. And I'm concerned because I think a lot of, I hear Vicksburg Square over and over again. Personally, I wish it was vaporized and they put up a Ferris wheel instead, but probably unlikely. Just if we end up 10 years from now with a lot of rental units, there'll be a small improvement in the lives of people who are trying to rent because there'll be more inventory. Hopefully that'll keep prices in check a bit. But we'll end up with a lot of renters, and the people that will really make out will be the landlords. And I've had kids renting apartments in Boston and other areas, and they get treated very badly by landlords in general. So, and anytime there's an article about affordable housing in the New York Times, I read it. It seems like there's not a lot ever said about Massachusetts, California, Colorado, Maryland. Other places are building small footprint houses, like 250 square feet, 400 square feet. You pay your rent for a certain number of years, and it becomes part of your equity in the house, and you own it after a certain period of time. I just think there's a lot of people who, if this is done right, would be able to own their first home and have, I think that's good for the community too, and have some equity, some foothold in the economy, and not get shut out and end up, we don't end up a nation of renters, and this area doesn't end up an area where people rent but they can't buy. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Okay, items for our next agenda. In addition to our standard items, Jurisdiction Framework Committee Working Group update, the Housing Working Group update, an invitation to mass development, and we'll discuss environmental issues. Does anyone recall the issue after environmental issues? Okay, thank you very much. Military
Affairs.
Military affairs. Okay, so that will, just a heads up, that will be coming next,
After environmental issues.
after environmental
So that's
issues.
our March submission.
Yes. Okay, we've reached the end of our agenda. There's a motion to adjourn. I will accept it.
Second.
Dan, second by Robert. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say nay. Without objection, the motion passes unanimously. We are adjourned.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.